this joker up, and then we're going to watch a Bible Project video. Y'all excited? Yeah, I did too, you know. All right. Are y'all quiet, or am I just over enthusiastic?
Yes. Yes. You asked an or question. The answer is
Yes.
yes.
Ooh, there it is. Hear it? All right. All right, Book of Job, chapter 16. Y'all ready? You are paying attention. That's what I thought. All right, let's get this. I'm not talking to you, Siri. I'm definitely not doing it now. Okay. There it is. Y'all can read that, can't you? Okay. Okay. Is that right? Terry says, yep. And the eyes have it. There we go. Okay. Chapter 9. So let's recap it just a little bit to kind of talk about what's going on. So we have the Jews taken away into captivity. Which captivity took away the southern tribes of Judah? It's all extra credit for you. Not everybody all at once. Which empire took away the southern tribes of Judah, including Jerusalem? Syria is not even close to being the right answer. Keep going. No, not even him. Come on, y'all. Babylon. Kate got it. It's in the notes, y'all. I mean, I'm not going to shame everybody, but I'm telling you, you kind of got to remember a little bit of this, right? So you have, especially in Daniel, he goes through all the empires. So you have the northern tribes, which are taken away by which empire? The northern tribes. Assyria. Not Syria. Close. I know you would have, Faye. Assyria. The southern tribes, they're not taken away by Assyria. They have a little bit longer period. Get this guy named Hezekiah or whatever, and he was king, and he was okay enough to be kind of used by God to protect Jerusalem and Judah, southern tribes. Next empire comes along, takes over Assyria, which is the Babylonian Empire. They get taken away into exile. The Babylonians lose their empire to a combo force of the Medes and the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire, of which Darius I is the first ruler, and then after him, basically, you got this guy named Ahasuerus, a.k.a. Xerxes, right? So if you've seen the movie 300, which I can't recommend as a Christian, but if you've seen it already, then, well, you know, that's the guy, right? Didn't look anything like that, but, you know, that's what fiction's all for. So you have Xerxes or Ahasuerus, who's the king in the book of Esther. He has a big old party for like half a year, 7-day binge drinking, asks his wife to come present her beauty before his friends. She says no thanks. She gets kicked out, find a replacement. You got Jewish girl Esther. She's beautiful. She wins. God favors her. And then wouldn't you know it, you got Mordecai the uncle, and then you've got this guy named Haman, and they're feuding pretty bad, right? They have beef, as the children say. And then you've got a plan hatched by Haman to kill all the Jews because he's upset that Mordecai won't bow before his awesomeness that he thinks that he has. Little does Haman know, Queen Esther, the new one, is also Jewish, so she would have to be executed as well. So the king, Ahasuerus or Xerxes, says, do whatever you want, you're paying for it. Sign it with my signet ring. He makes a law in the Medes and the Persians, which it cannot be altered or changed, as we've learned from the book, that at a certain time, certain day of the month, they're all going to be executed. Fast forward. Haman gets hung on his own gallows or impaled on his own pike, whichever version you have there. And then Mordecai takes over, and he now has his signet ring by the king's authority, and he says, listen, I can't change the law, but what I can do is amend it to say, yeah, this certain day, you're going to try to execute the Jews, but the Jews can fight back. That's the solution of the day, right? That's where we are. Everybody with me? Okay, great. Esther chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same month, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. Wouldn't you know it? I mean, this book is all about, like, here's a thing that's not great, and then the reversal takes place. Of course, the irony here is when the reversal takes place, never ever in this book does it say that God was the cause of the reversal. But if you've read your Bible long enough, you'll recognize that God's will is being executed throughout this book, although he's not mentioned necessarily overtly. It's not like Job where you have that kind of behind the spiritual veil curtain thing where there's like a day where the angels present themselves before God. That's Job. And then as soon as that scene is over, then we go into the three parts of Job where you see it unfold and unfurl. You don't see Satan, but he's working behind the scenes. Esther is the opposite. You don't really see Satan. You see God working behind the scenes, even though it's not specifically mentioned that his will is being carried out. Okay. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in the cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. So before you had Haman, and everybody was afraid and terrified of this guy because he was King Ahasuerus' right-hand man. I mean, there was a private dinner between the king and the queen, and guess who was invited? Haman. And he thought, because I'm just so awesome, I get a private dinner with the king and queen, I'm the best. And then we reveal at the second dinner, Esther's like, I made sure you were here because you're the man who's trying to kill my people. And that was the reversal, right? So Mordecai now has taken all of Haman's responsibilities and power because he deserves it, right? Obviously, he was the one who saved the king from a plot back in the day. Okay, verse 4. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, also killed that guy, and Dalphon, and Ashpatha, and Poratha, and Adaliah, and Aridatha, and Parmashta, and Arishai, and Aridi, and that guy. The 10 sons of Haman, there we go, I know that guy. The 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they laid no hands on the plunder. So the entire family of Haman seemed to be pretty upset that Mordecai was now in charge instead of their father, and so they did not make it. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. All right. The very day the number of those killed in Susa the citadel was reported to the king said to Queen Esther, verse 12, in Susa the citadel the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your wish? It shall be granted to you, and what is your further request? It shall be fulfilled. Okay, so, I mean, the king's he's setting up Esther here. All right, so this is like the third time that he has been, hey, what can I give you? What can I help you with? How can we work together to give you what you want? Now, contrast that to who this guy was in chapters 1 and 2. Do you recall? You may have had an impression of King Ahasuerus in chapter 1 that this guy is a jerk. and he drinks too much. And he is trying to parade his wife around and show how pretty she is. This guy's the worst. Did you have that impression from chapter 1? Yeah, I did too, right? Now, you look at this and you're like, is this the same guy? Well, let me answer that. Yeah, it's the same guy. But interestingly enough, if we look at the historical records that are outside of Scripture and talk about what Xerxes had experienced in chapter 1 versus where we are now, there are some years that have gone by. There's an interesting thing that takes place, which we can't confirm because there's no book, chapter, and verse, but it's an interesting thought that you may, if you care about this at all, maybe you can look into it a bit more. So we have King Xerxes. He's picking up from his granddad Darius, and he's going and they're kind of expanding their empire. So you have the Medo-Persian Empire. They're doing pretty good for themselves. They expand what the Assyrians had and the Babylonians had. They're kind of going out. I mean, if you fast forward a little while, you had this guy named Alexander. He's going to whoop everybody in the entire world, essentially, in a little while. But right now, Xerxes is the guy. He's the one. There is a humbling military exchange that takes place when they decide they're going to go into Greece, where kind of right below where Alexander would come from in like one generation. Anyone recall what took place when they went into Greece? The Medo-Persian Empire? When the Medo-Persian or the Persian Empire went into Greece to try to conquer it, they got some resistance, which is weird for them. If you don't recall, there's kind of a myth about it that actually took place in real life, but it's a little bit less dramatic. They went into Greece, and Greece was different because there was no real centralized government at this point in time when the Persians went in. So they wanted to go into Athens and just take over. That's not how Greece really worked back then. They had city-states. So they all kind of represented themselves. So it wasn't like if you take over the capital, you get all of it, you know? It's one of those things where if you're trying to invade America, for example, and you take D.C., well, you got a whole bunch of other states that kind of do their own thing and, don't mess with anything below Mason-Dixon line, right? That's not a good idea. I know that much. And so it's kind of like that where you have these different states and they all represent themselves and do their own thing. And Athens is, philosophy and artwork and so on. And then they decided they wanted to go and talk to Sparta. Now, if you know history, the Spartans were a whole other thing, right? So the legend goes that they went to Sparta and said, we're taking over, and Spartan says, okay, sounds great. We'll open the doors for you, and we'll open the gates. And that's the joke, is the hot gates, is there's this one mountain pass that the entire army had to go through. And that's called a bottleneck, and that is a defensible place. So they say 300 Spartans were sent. All right, cool. I guess 300-ish Spartans led by King Leonidas, right? Almost named my first son that, Leonidas. And this guy, he can't officially send the entire Spartan military to defend the hot gates. He's just going to send 300. Now, at the end of the day, it was more like 10,000 people total that were there. 300 Spartans were kind of leading them. And so you've got the the Persian military and all their stuff coming into Greece, and they have to pass through this mountain range where there's one small gap. And so if you add all your guys there, and the military has to march through you to get into Greece, and they're slowed down, and they start dying, and your military is losing people left and right from just... Greece was not to be messed with, as the next empire would tell you, right? And so he lost. He couldn't get Greece. This is the first time that he went to a place to try to conquer and to try to rule, and mission failed. And so he had to go back home. And so if you look at the book of Esther, and you know that Ahasuerus is actually Xerxes, and you see chapter 1 where he's like partying for a full half a year because he's the best. And then you see him here at the end of the book, and he realizes, I'm maybe not invincible. Maybe I'm not the greatest in the world. I've been humbled because I lost to 300 dudes on a mountain pass. So that's a historical theory, right? No book, chapter, and verse that kind of shows that, but historically we know what took place between chapter 1 and chapter 9. So keep that in mind. Again, if you're not a history person or you don't care about that at all, just ignore it. But if you think it's interesting at all, there's a whole lot of issues there. What you going to do, Lisa? You going to ignore it? Okay, great. Great. I'm glad I've dedicated my life to learning these things to share with you all who love it so much. Yeah. It did. Can't recommend it, but if you've seen it, okay. All right, there's some wild stuff in that movie. If you've seen it, you know. Verse 13, and Esther said, if it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. Also, a.k.a. impaled on the pike. Right, that's a bit different than hung on gallows. Yeah, okay. So the king's commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged, quote unquote. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed, ironically, 300 men in Susa, and they laid no hands on the plunder. So they're kind of restricting themselves to, you might say, defending themselves only, but not going so far as to be conquerors. None of this is great, but when it comes to what they're doing here, they're doing it, I guess, in the most respectful way. I guess. Again, none of this is good, but when it comes to them being murdered or them protecting themselves and taking care of those that want to murder them, you might have some wiggle room morally, ethically. I don't know. Verse 16. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them. No big deal when you're in the empire, right? But they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar. How are we looking on time? Okay. And on the 14th day they rested and made that a day of feasting and gladness. What's the day of feasting and gladness called nowadays or back then? Purim, right? So you had this feast, this festival, this holy holiday in which they're gathering together to remember the time that they were on the chopping block and then they were saved by God. That's their feast, right? We won after the book of Malachi, written about in 1 Maccabees, and that's where Hanukkah comes from, right? Everybody know that? Okay. So if you don't, there's tons. So you have really Purim, and then you've got Hanukkah, which comes from the first book of Maccabees. There was a rebellion. They were trying to kick the Hellenists, the Alexander, out of their city, and it went pretty well until it didn't. And then, you got 2nd Maccabees and 3rd Maccabees and 4th Maccabees, and this is old hat to most of you, right? Okay. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and the 14th and rested on the 15th day, making that day a feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of all the villages who live in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, holy day, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. So, there you go. Okay. Let's wrap this joker up. Verse 20. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far. Obliging? Not obligating? Obliging? Is that correct? Okay. Them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, And as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, from mourning into a holy day, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written on them, because Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast pure, that is, cast lots to crush and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, they called these days Purim, after the term pure. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter and what they had faced in this matter and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written, and at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every clan, province, and city, that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. I mean, this Mordecai dude could write, I'll tell you what. Okay, verse 29. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, gave full written authority confirming the second letter about Purim. They were sent to all the Jews, the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, in words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them. And as soon as they obligated themselves and their offspring in regard to their fast and their lamenting, the command of Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. Okay, here we go. Chapter 10 is the summary of how great Mordecai became because Haman was no longer on the playing field. Y'all with me on that? Now, for sake of time, and I really want you to see this if you haven't, we're going to transition now to the Bible Project video, and there's a reason why I did not open with this, is because it will give you play-by-play of this play, this screenplay of what this book is all about, and then show you the irony within this particular book and its layout. So let's go ahead and move on to that, and then we'll close out.
In this story are two Jews, Mordecai and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in this story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now, this is a curious book in the Bible, mainly for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once, which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days. And it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. This is like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now, after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now, right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai's Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called pur in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther's going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai, he's confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders aloud. He says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery, and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, if I perish, I perish. Now, in what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request of both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night, the king, he can't sleep, and he has the royal chronicles read to him for good bedtime reading, and he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution, and the king in that moment orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. Now this moment in the story, it's a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that first of all she's Jewish, and second that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all of the Jews. Now the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage, and he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made for Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way for Haman to go. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all of the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter-decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decreed day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on a second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued from annihilation. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast of Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember, Purim. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now of his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal, right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees at the end. Esther and Mordecai, they first saved the king, but now in the end they save all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edicts and banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scenes, and then Esther's 2 banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story: Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. Beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking and anger and sex and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are a part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles or eating impure foods. And so the story's not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral example, as if it endorses all of their behavior. But they are put forward as models of trust and hope when things get really bad. And so the book of Esther comes back to that question with which we began: why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, when his people are in exile, when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God is done with Israel? Has God abandoned his promises? And the book of Esther says no. It invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history, and he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. And so the book of Esther asks us to be willing to trust God's providence even when we can't see it working, and to hope that no matter how bad things get, God is committed to redeeming his world. And that's what the book of Esther is all about.
To make sure that you saw the video, though, again, I use those videos often, can't endorse everything that they say, but I think that seeing it visually is
The story's
is
set
helpful
right
for
after.
me, anyway. So, okay, thank you. 15 minutes till worship.